Hello, and welcome to the lecture portion of my lecture recital. My name is Greg Bruce, and I'm a third-year DMA student here at the University of Toronto. So, my lecture is entitled The Analogue Electroacoustic Saxophone, Research Creation in a Nascent Medium. And today I'm going to talk about four main topics. First, an introduction to my research. Second, I'm going to review my recital. If you haven't seen the recital, I encourage you to follow the links below or in the description so that you can watch it, because I'm going to be talking about my performances and the pieces. In reviewing my recital, I'm going to be talking about the analog saxophone systems that each piece engages with, and this will cover the technology involved as well as the notation system. Thirdly, I'm going to cover my methodology that involves research creation. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about the impact that I aim for this research to have. So to start, my research explores the analog electroacoustic saxophone, an innovative yet understudied approach to electroacoustic creation. The saxophone has an established performance practice in nearly every genre of music, including pop, classical, jazz, and folk. Similarly, analog technology revolutionized music in the early 20th century, and today offers a viable alternative to digital tools. Despite the commonality of these two media, they have rarely been merged in ways that fully exploit the interesting qualities of both. Combining the unique sonic characteristics of the saxophone with the idiosyncrasies of various analog devices, I've created an iteration of feedback saxophone, a saxophone that, in addition to its conventional sound, can produce chromatic, microtonal, and dynamic feedback tones. While there are examples of similar systems, there is no standardization, few professional recordings, limited scores, and only minor documentation with regards to fingering and equipment. To explore analog saxophone systems, such as feedback saxophone, I employ a process as methods approach that includes improvising, composing, and performing, as well as traditional scholarship. Through these methods, my research creation aims to expand on saxophone performance practice, add to the broader electroacoustic performance tradition, and build on our understanding of analog technology as a creative medium. So to start the recital overview, I'm going to talk about my piece, Stride, which I finished this year in 2020. So the analog saxophone system that this piece employs is feedback saxophone. And this iteration of feedback saxophone turns the instrument into a resonance chamber, which induces feedback. When some people hear this, they think it might be key sound amplification, but it's not. It's simply creating feedback from the resonance chamber. And there's no blowing involved. So in this particular piece, I wanted to fully explore what I could do without conventional playing. So in this system, I use specific fingerings to induce discrete, repeatable feedback tones. So much in the same way when one is playing the saxophone conventionally, we add and take away fingers, and that changes the length of the vibrating air column, which changes the pitch. So in the same way, I'm adding and taking away fingers with this system. And this changes the shape of the resonance chamber, which changes the feedback pitch. And the way that feedback is induced is that there's a microphone deep in the bell of the saxophone, and that is fed into an amp. And that, as you will see in the video, I need to stand really close to the amp for feedback to occur. And some aspects of the equipment is very specific. For example, the amp I'm using is one of maybe only a half dozen that I found that actually work with this particular set of fingerings I've discovered. Whereas a variety of microphones can be used. I don't really think it's limited to the one I'm using today. And the pedals I'm using as well are fairly generic. I think you could definitely get a similar result with different pedals. In addition to the equipment and the specific saxophone fingerings, I'm also playing with the X, Y, and Z axes. So as you see, I walk towards the amp, and that affects the pitch, And also, I believe, if not in this one, then my next etude, I am playing with the positioning on the x-axis, which affects the pitch. So here on the next slide, you'll see some of the notation for this piece. And I decided to use a two-staff system for this. And the bottom staff contains the fingerings. So because there's no conventional pitch and there is a certain logic to how these feedback fingerings relate to conventional fingerings, this bottom staff has the main kind of fingering that the feedback pitch is based on, and then additions or subtractions of what fingers to actually change the pitch. Yeah, and the top staff actually is the resultant pitch. So for someone who's not familiar with the system at all, you would need to purely focus on the bottom staff so that you could know what fingers to press. But as you became more familiar and started to understand the logic of the system, then you could look at the top, because you would know what fingering would produce that note. So the second piece I played was JOJI YUASA's Not I But the Wind, which was written in Berlin in 1976. And the analog saxophone system that this piece employs is 2 mics and an echo chamber. So it was written, I guess the title of the piece is Not I But the Wind for alto saxophone and echo chamber. But really, in order to employ an echo chamber, this piece needs 2 microphones as well. So using a microphone to the right of the performer and a microphone to the left of the performer has to move in between them. Now, the microphone on the right is what we would call wet. It's affected with the echo chamber. And the one on the left is dry. So as the performer moves along the x-axis, they get closer to the wet microphone and their sound is more processed, and then they move to the left and their sound is less processed. So what is an echo chamber? The composer provides no details for what an echo chamber is, how to produce it, what parameters maybe that they're looking for. So the non-specific directions and the lack of specificity for the equipment, to me, gives a performer a degree of interpretive freedom, which is nice. So I imagine that in the 70s, when this piece was written, that the composer would have been hearing a lot of echo chamber on psychedelic rock and roll. It was certainly sweeping the world by then, from artists like Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles, and the type of delay and kind of time-based effects were very popular and still remain today. And now the devices that they were using were all analog, reverb, and delay. So I chose, in order to create this echo chamber, I chose an analog spring reverb and an analog delay. So the last thing with performing this piece that I'd like to talk about is that there's an element of the live versus the recorded. So I was really fortunate for my recital that I was able to record it in an environment where we could kind of separate the two microphones. So that allowed me a certain to control, I guess, the sonic result of what was going on. In a live setting, you would be hearing the affected sound in the room, and that might bleed into the dry microphone. So it would be much more difficult to produce a kind of a very clean, dry sound on your left microphone. So that just presents certain limitations of how you perform it in live versus recorded. Now, to briefly look at the notation, we see here this is a 2-staff system. And the bottom staff of each system shows what microphone you're supposed to be using. And if you look closely at the top of this bottom staff of each system, it says microphone 1, echo, and at the bottom it says microphone 2, ordinary. And the performer needs to follow the line as the piece develops, and this corresponds to the x-axis. Now I suppose there's nothing saying that the wet microphone should be on the left and the dry one should be on the, sorry, the wet on the right and the dry on the left, but this seemed to me kind of logical. And one really elegant thing about this is that it uses pretty basic technology, 2 microphones, and a pretty basic effect, this echo chamber. Now, in more recent times, certainly since the 2000s, a lot of work and research has gone into gestural recognition and mapping space to respond to where the performer is or what the performer is doing with their body. But this is a really kind of low-tech, elegant way to have a similar effect. So that's what I really love about this piece. Playing it, you get to learn about where to position mics, what is an echo chamber, what effects you might use, and yeah, it doesn't. There are no computers involved, or there certainly don't have to be. So I really like this. The notation, it's clear, it's simple, and I love the system because it's basic, but I think very effective. So moving on. My third piece was an improv that I'm currently working on. And now this improv I have titled on the slide Etude number 2. So the pieces I'm writing for feedback saxophone are intended to be an introduction to my iteration of this instrument. So they're really exploring I guess a limited range of musical ideas that are made available to the performer through this system. So as I kind of discover idiomatic language using these limited musical means, then the piece, the improvisation kind of coalesces and congeals into a composition. So this is not just a totally free improvisation. It's an improvisation that is working with a particular set of vocabulary that explores particular musical ideas that eventually will turn into a composition that will be notated. So that's why I have this listed, the analog saxophone system, as Feedback Saxophone Plus. So I'm basically using the same equipment and settings as the first piece. But in this piece, or in this improvisation, sorry, the feedback is not the main kind of driver of melody and rhythm. It's primarily drones. And the drones are providing harmony and some counterpoint to the conventional playing. So in the first piece, no conventional playing. I wanted to explore just that. And in this next eventual composition, I'm exploring the two, feedback saxophone and conventional playing. One of the challenges in composing and improvising a piece like this is that the feedback notes really limit what conventional tones you can play. So the feedback tones are induced by very specific fingering. And for me, the improvisation process is where I figure out what other fingerings and what other notes can I play while I leave this feedback fingering depressed. And I have to be careful that sometimes if I add other fingerings and I'm playing at the same time, it changes the pitch of this drone. I'm sure you can hear you can hear that in the recording. So that's what I'm trying to explore in this piece. Now, additionally, you did definitely see me move on the x-axis on this one. So you can see me as I'm playing a note, and I can hold the pitch steady, and it's not going anywhere. But then as I move away from the amp, the pitch of the feedback drone descends. So again, it's a pretty rudimentary exploration or use of this tactic in this piece, but I wanted to demonstrate it, I wanted to use it, and maybe it'll be more thoroughly explored in another in my next improvisation or composition. And so as this piece and as my improvising with the system has developed, the notation has had to change as well. So here we see a sample of some notation, the notation I'm using for this feedback plus conventional playing. So you can see here I have one staff. So there's only one staff, and yeah, it actually contains more information than my previous two-staff system, because this not only contains your feedback tones, it also contains conventional playing. So you can see here the regular note heads, they represent the conventional tones you're supposed to be playing. And unless otherwise indicated, it's going to be a standard fingering. But now you have the diamond note heads, and they represent the feedback tone. And you can see that there's a plus sign with your with the other fingers that you should be putting down to produce that feedback pitch. Now, I didn't play this passage today in this improvisation, so yeah, I just know for a fact I didn't. But this represents the kind of notation system I'm going to be using once this piece again is kind of codified into a composition and stops existing as an improvisation. So the last piece of my recital was Judges by Colin Stetson. And in this piece, the analog saxophone system I'm calling Amplified Vocalizations Plus. So the main thing that I wanted to explore in doing an interpretation of this piece is using a contact mic to amplify my vocalizations. Now, if you go and listen to the piece, you'll know that these vocalizations happen while I'm kind of playing the saxophone conventionally. And this is a key factor in the musical language of Colin Stetson. Now, I'm calling it Amplified Vocalizations Plus is because in Stetson's full setup, he uses maybe a couple of dozen mics. Certainly in his studio sessions, he would be doing that. But for me, so I would need to be doing that to do like a duplication of one of his performances. But I wanted to keep things limited. I'm not there yet with my research and with my musical or technological know-how. Yeah, so in addition to these, the myriad of mics he's using, they're mixed creatively to create his aesthetic, which is really important. Now, a couple of quotes from his second album that this song appears on. The first is, all songs recorded live in single takes with no overdubs or loops. And this is in the liner notes. And the second thing in his liner notes is, all noise and distortion on this recording is intentional. So this is him really clearly laying out his the sonic aesthetic that he's going for in his performances, in his compositions. And I think it's really important for anyone who's looking to either play his music or play music that really embraces his aesthetic to take these things into account. So while I didn't go for the full multi-microphone setup, in my own practice, I was really using a contact mic on my vocals and then occasionally a contact mic on my horn. Now, I was really lucky to be working with a great sound tech for my recital, and he was able to set up a bunch of different microphones in a recording space. So at the time of this recording, I haven't heard what it all sounds like. I've just performed it. So I'm really excited to see what we might be able to come up with. Maybe even a version that that sounds more like what Stetson does, rather than just kind of the acoustic versions that I've been doing on my own. But to add to that, to my interpretation of his piece, and to embrace this aesthetic of of noise and not using overdubs or loops. So to me, that is connected to analog technology, which of course I'm very interested in. I used an analog reverb pedal to create a lot of the room sound that is so important to his music. I think without it, it's really missing something. I didn't want to add it in post or put some like a digital patch or something on it. I really felt like using a pedal was which has noise and has problems and imperfections. I thought that was kind of in line with his aesthetic. So while Stetson himself doesn't work with musical notation, I was lucky to come across a transcription of this piece. And the transcription is by Christopher Harold, who's an academic, and he wrote a dissertation that covers kind of the current state of saxophonist composers that are doing a lot of solo work. And happily, Colin Stetson is one of the artists that he covers. And you can see that, okay, here we have a two-staff system again, except this time the top staff is the conventional saxophone, the bottom staff is the voice. So it's really encouraging that there are people out there that are covering this work, which I feel is really important to the future of saxophone and what its capabilities are when combined in innovative ways with technology. But with that, it's there's something lacking in this transcription. And the thing is, there's no instructions, descriptions as to the technology, the role of technology that is so pivotal to Colin Stetson's music. So in interpreting this piece, looking at the transcription, of course, was helpful to learn the notes and get an idea of the rhythm and the form of the song, but that really is only a small part of the overall aesthetic that is, I believe, just integral to creating, to interpreting or creating a piece that embraces Stetson's aesthetic. So this is something that my research intends to do, is to add to this gap. I don't want to think about the technology as an afterthought. I'm thinking about it as I said, integral to an informed performance of this kind of music. So, to continue, my methodology. So you heard 4 different pieces, 2 of which were my own compositions. Well, I suppose one of them was a composition, the other was an improvisation. Then you heard the YUASA piece, which is an avant-garde electroacoustic piece, and then a piece by Stetson, which is certainly avant-pop, perhaps. Some people have suggested that that's a good way to describe his music. And my methodology is an iterative process that includes 3 different processes, which are improvisation, composition, and notation, and that's kind of one process, and performance. So today you got to experience my performative process as well as my improvisational process. So a few notes on these processes. So for improvisation, for this kind of music, which, as I said before, contains very little documentation, there are things you can hear out there, not a lot of them. But when technology is playing such a strong role, it's really hard to tell what the technology is doing if we can only hear it. And likewise, the scores that do exist contain very little information. So improvisation plays a key role in developing an improvisation or a creative practice, in this medium. And it certainly does involve a lot of trial and error. It involves trial and error to one degree with interpreting a piece of Stetson's, where there's no standard practice on how do you mic vocalizations while one is playing the saxophone. So a lot of trial and error to see how that works in a live setting, how it works in a recorded setting. But there's even more trial and error when, for someone like myself who has this almost an imaginary idea of feedback saxophone. I encountered it one day and then got to thinking, well, how can this be expanded? There's maybe only one or two other people in the world who have a professional practice using feedback and saxophone. And so really it's trial and error, and improvisation is just the only way to develop. And one of the things that improvisation can also do is help develop an idiomatic vocabulary. So as I mentioned with my third piece, which was my improvisation, that was combining feedback saxophone with conventional playing, the feedback fingerings limit what conventional notes you can play. And while there are certainly more combinations that I could have explored during that improvisation, but I was really trying to play things that were idiomatic, that made sense harmonically, melodically, and also made sense under the fingers. Because I think that's a really important thing when you're developing a new system, to have it demonstrate things that make sense musically and that people can relate to. Perhaps if they're not saxophonists, or if they are saxophonists, they can understand kind of how the fingering works and how it interacts with your system. So for composition / notation, this helps standardize my improvisation practice. So it standardizes it in a way that I take the idiomatic vocabulary that I discover through improvisation, and the things that I really like I end up writing down in a notation program. And then I can take those things and rearrange them and develop them through notation, and that helps me form a composition. Now, in addition to standardizing the vocabulary, what it also does is it pushes the vocabulary. So what I mean by that is when I'm improvising, I'm finding idiomatic language. So things that sit somewhat easily under the fingers. But then if I take these ideas and bring them into a notation program, then my mind goes to other places. It goes, well, what's possible? Maybe I can play this succession of notes, or maybe I can integrate these other feedback notes. And I think in a way that's different than when I'm on my horn. Because when I'm on my horn, I have my own kind of physical abilities and my own vocabulary on the kind of conventional vocabulary on the horn, and that leads my improvising in a certain way. But when I'm composing, I'm kind of removed from the physicality of the instrument and maybe some of the physicality of my own personal vocabulary. And so it allows me, of course, keeping in mind the limitations of the feedback system. I'm not inventing new things while composing. I know my notes, I know my fingerings, I know what's possible, but the composing, it pushes me into maybe more difficult or more challenging ways of performing with the system. And finally, the third element of my research creation methodology is performance. So performing the works of others really allows me to test their systems and allows me to test the technology they're using and test their notation. So performing gives me an embodied knowledge of this test. Not only is it effective musically, but how does it sit under the fingers? How do I feel about the logic of the notation? Does it make sense to me? Often contemporary music, the notation can be fairly obtuse, and hopefully with repeated study, the logic comes through and you get used to it. So this is definitely a factor when performing the works of others. And so when I do perform the works of others and find notational systems that work, saxophone and technology interactions that are effective or interesting, well, what do? I take the technology that I like and I bring it into my improvisations. I take the notation that is effective, and I bring them whole hog, or at least I might be inspired by them and bring that into my notation system. So improvisation, composition, and performance, they're happening concurrently, and they inform one another. One doesn't finish and the other begins. It's really all informing the other. So finally, the impact of this research. Well, I aim for it to provide a resource for artists and scholars who are interested in the saxophone, electroacoustic music, and analog technology. I really hope it adds to our understanding of electroacoustic performance as well as saxophone performance practice. My original works will contribute to Canadian new music and to the ever-growing solo and electroacoustic saxophone repertoire. And ultimately, my work, I hope to disseminate and to otherwise develop the creative power of this nascent medium. Thank you.